Presentation will be about the Good Friday Agreement, and as most of you here know, the Good Friday Agreement is an agreement signed in 1998, a major development in the Northern Ireland peace process. It's made up of the multi-party agreement between most of Northern Ireland's political parties and the British agreement between the British and the Irish governments. And there's not a better person in the city of Cleveland to present this agreement than our own John Myers. A hand for John Myers, please.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, guys. Thanks for being out here on a cold winter night, and hopefully share just a brief overview of the Good Friday Accord. We're coming up to this major anniversary, which is April 10th. Will be 25 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So, just have this opening slide here to show you that this was truly a historic day in April. It happened to end up being signed on Good Friday, which was April 10th that year. Of course, as you know, Easter's a moving holiday, so they didn't necessarily plan on that, but given the history with the Easter Rising, it seems like a good follow-up to that, to have it on Good Friday. Of course, even in coming together with the divisions in the community, the British and the Loyalists tend to call it the Belfast Agreement. We'll stick with Taoiseach Bernie Ahern's title of Good Friday Agreement. So, you see that you have the British and the Irish tricolor with the Dove of Peace. Really, when Mr. Chambers talked about multi-parties, it involves more than that. But obviously, these were the two principal parties that should have been involved, but a lot happened to get them to that point. And what was different from all the other times when they've tried to move the dial forward to a better life for those folks living in the 6 counties was Americans really made a significant difference in this. Our country did. As you can see, even in the proclamation of 1916, the folks that were fighting for independence for Ireland recognized the support by her exiled children here in America. And I have the club's logo up there because that means you. There's tens of millions of us here, but that strength of numbers and the passion in people's own family and ancestry and history is what helped get the attention of the American government to say, we need to be involved in this issue. It can't be ignored anymore. So really, we all were one of the many indispensable elements that helped to bring the Good Friday Accord across the finish line. Also, we see from the 1916 proclamation, in every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. They were talking about in the 1600s and the 1700s, 1798 with Wolfe Tone and the Young Irelanders in 48 and the Fenians in 67 and then again in 16. This, I'm trying to give a broad perspective to show that this was a continuation of this multi-century struggle for Irish identity and for Irish peace and unity and recognition as a nation amongst all the rest of the nations. What was significant about the Good Friday Accord was the recognition after 30 years, 3 decades long of what you all know as the Troubles, or what's called the Troubles. People were weary, people were tired. The leadership on both the Loyalist and the Nationalist side realized that essentially things were at a draw. And both the people resulting and using violence understood that, the governments understood that, Westminster and London understood that essentially things were at a draw. And we could only make life worse by continuing the armed struggle. So this was an effort to continue this, but to put away the gun, and focus on the political side of the fight for independence. These were the Americans. Those of you that know me know my not only my Irish partisanship, but my American political partisanship. But truly, without these folks, as I said, so many indispensable parties, but the deal would not have happened without the folks you're looking at here. Obviously, first we know President Clinton. Just a quick history. In the 1992, his mom was Scotch-Irish, Kelly, from, I think, Fermanagh. But he had some ancestry and some history in Ireland, and the combination of being a smart kid from Arkansas, trained by the Jesuits at Georgetown, made him a very formidable political force, and obviously very successful. So in the 1992 primary, if you can remember, he had some real challenges before the New Hampshire primary, and it was a contested, hard-fought primary season. So coming into the New York primary, those Irish activists who were involved largely in the MacBride Principles campaign, in the Cause for Irish Freedom, held an Irish presidential forum. And the two goals were to get the presidential candidates at this vulnerable time to make a commitment to support the MacBride Principles of fair employment, and to agree, if they were elected president, to send an envoy to address the issues arising in the 6 counties. I have Mrs. Clinton up there as well, because she was, of course, they were a strong political team, but also a critical element of this that came together. So many things came together to make this pie, or this cake, rise in the way it did. Was that at this time, too, there was an international and local women's movement that had a very strong voice in reaching beyond some of the barriers and traditions that kept people locked within their own communities. And she gave great support and fuel to that community in the 6 counties that helped lay the foundation for seeing a different path forward. So I feel that she was significantly involved in this, not only as the president's partner in the White House, but in working with the women to help bring peace to the 6 counties. One of the most significant things after he was elected president then, George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell from Maine, had a great, strong history. He was a federal judge, a lawyer. He had held other elected office, and in addition to being a United States Senator, he was also the majority leader. In 1994, he chose not to run again. He could have run, he could have won, he could have stayed as majority leader. So when he retired, President Clinton called him and said, "Listen, I have a job for you." And Mitchell was up for consideration for the United States Supreme Court, could have had any corporate job that he wanted, or other avenues to open to him. And President Clinton asked him to take on this position. At first, to downplay it, was just to be focused on trade between, to try and bring investment and trade into the 6 counties. And there was a White House Trade Investment Council, which brought together all the parties, focused on the narrow issues of economics to help take some of the politics out of it. As it ended up, he ended up evolving into essentially being asked by the British and Irish governments to help chair some negotiations based upon things that had been happening on both those islands that had led up to this point. He established the Mitchell Principles, which were these 5 principles. The basic issue that he got across is he made this a precursor to the multi-parties involved in the talks. You got to lay down your guns. You got to make a strong, irreversible commitment to politics and not the gun, and that you would agree to live by whatever agreement was result. So he helped establish these principles up front to set the tone for this, which helped focus some hurdles and some energies at the early part of these negotiations that he came up with. if you forget, hear nothing else tonight, the most important thing Senator Mitchell helped, he didn't invent the idea of consent, but he focused on this and gave it voice that this is only moving forward with consent, meaning all parties, of course not everybody's going to agree, but that the future of the 6 counties was going to be based upon the principle of respect and equality, but primarily that underlined word was it's only going to move forward when we all have consent, or a majority has consent for the path to choose. To go back, we could be here all night and listening to John talk about the history of Michael Collins and this significant anniversary of his death, and what a great loss that was, and what could have been different is always a great speculation game if Collins had lived. But to go back, this is why the Good Friday Court had any life or purpose, was because at that time, at the end of the War for Irish Independence, was in order to placate the Loyalists, I hate to say, speak in religious terms, as far as Protestants, largely Protestant community, the people, the plantation, the folks would come over a couple hundred years ago for free land and economic opportunity for themselves. They were the ones threatening with the gun. They were the ones threatening, hey, we're not, you can't give a free state status or any unification or any level of independence that would be happening on a Dublin. And so in order to placate the Orangemen, they carved out these 6 counties. And what you can see, what I want you to see in this map is, we're all familiar today from reading the papers here in Ohio and elsewhere in the country, the word gerrymandering. And this was one of the ultimate gerrymanders. You can see the 4 traditional provinces of the island of Ireland. This 6-county statelet, the Northern Ireland, is only a recent, if you talk in terms of ancient history of Ireland, a recent fictitious creation that the English unilaterally conceived and carved out and decided the boundaries from London. So you can see the traditional Ulster is 9 counties, but that wouldn't guarantee a significant enough Loyalist majority. So they had a gerrymander Ulster, cut out 30% of it, 3 counties, and we're left with 6 counties that in the total had a majority Loyalist population. They went ahead then and created this Northern Ireland statelet that completely disenfranchised the nationalist / Catholic minority, and ran it that way, much as Jim Crow laws that we have in our own country historically, as far as, you know, working to keep people from getting a job. They couldn't vote, they couldn't get housing. Many of them were beaten and tortured, and in order to continue to keep that pressure on immigration out of the 6 counties on the Loyalist community and preserve the benefits of the 6 counties for the Loyalists. This is a lot of a timeline that's leading up to it, so I won't go into obviously the history that most of you know, but it came up to the beginning of the Troubles, which really started in the 60s, modeled after the civil rights movement that was happening in our country. The nationalist Catholic minority in the 6 counties was experiencing all those same issues. In fact, the rallying cry, we shall overcome, became a familiar tune on the streets of Belfast and Derry. And in the Irish, Chucky Our Law means our time will come, and it translates into English. And this was sympathetic with the civil rights movement happening here in the States. And it was only after civil rights groups that started forming to advocate for housing, for the right to vote, for equal opportunity, for all these things that we understand as basic human rights, that the Loyalists began to fight back, and people were being, nationalists and Catholics were being killed. The Royal Ulster Constabulary was 90-some% Protestant Loyalist, maybe 90% Protestant, 100% loyalist. They were not here to enforce the law. And they, Irish kids were beaten regularly to death. They were tortured. They were held in prison without cause, without justification, without any rights. The British have, to this day, no constitution. They have no Bill of Rights. So the Catholic nationalists took to the streets to protest and march, were met with violent opposition, such as we saw in Bloody Sunday. And it really, the IRA had sort of disbanded over the years and was pretty much out of business. This is where the provisional IRA came back into existence at that time as a defensive force to say, hey, nobody's here protecting us. We don't have anybody keeping these guns from shooting us and killing us and maiming us and torturing us and stealing from us. So that was organized really as a defensive gesture. Just quickly, what helped lay the foundation then was after a couple decades of this turmoil and tensions, Jerry Adams and John Hume started having some personal talks, or started a dialogue, shall we say, and looking for a way to see. John Hume, as you know, from the SDLP, was a strong advocate for a peaceful approach to solving these issues and led many of those marches that we hear about. They started talking and developing a relationship. Martin McGuinness, who was from the IRA Army Council, started having secret talks with England's M16. And then in '92, Bill Clinton was elected president, which he had made these promises in the primary, and the Irish Americans were here to continue to push him and to hold him to those promises. He had an easier path to be responsive. He was from another generation. He wasn't from the World War II generation. The Cold War had, pretty much ended a couple of years before, and so that whole East-West tension was much less and didn't have to view our foreign policy only through those lenses. Our American State Department was very pro-English, very Anglophilic, and he had to fight them. It also probably helped at some more petty level the fact that John Major, who was Prime Minister then, worked actively to help and support President Bush in the '92 re-election. So it was a little easier to tell Prime Minister Major no. In '93, Hume and Adams resumed their dialogue, continued it, and some of these things are just laying the foundation. You have to remember, Sinn Féin members were ostracized, were essentially, they weren't allowed to speak even on TV. And it was really ironic when friends would come over who were Sinn Féin elected members of government or leaders would come here to Cleveland on tours and visits, and we would bring them on our local radio and TV stations. That they could speak here, but they couldn't even speak on their own home because, of course, they didn't have a First Amendment in Great Britain, and that their rights, and I have to say not just Great Britain, but the Republic also denied them the right to access to communicate through the TV and radio. So it was a process of normalizing some of these groups. There was a ceasefire in 1994 announced by the IRA due to continuing talks. So between Bill Clinton coming into the White House and Tony Blair coming into 10 Downing Street, there were two leaders, two younger leaders who were bringing a whole new view to what has been going on in the 6 counties. So it was a consistent push to keep the president focused in seeing the benefits. Not only was this the right thing to do, but that Irish Americans would hopefully support him for his work. So there was some base motivations, but the more he got involved, the more he took ownership of this and had involved himself like none other. So the fact that he appointed George Mitchell, who was such a well-recognized and important American political figure, brought great gravitas to Mitchell going over there. So it wasn't like he was just sending somebody from the State Department over to let's do the right thing and have talks. So he carried a lot of weight. They knew he talked to the president and that the president was interested in, and this was the president's eyes and ears on the ground. So to a lot of people here in this country who had worked hard, it was a huge success too, because the British were always saying, this is just a local issue, nothing to see here, keep moving. We're allowed to torture our own people, just it's domestic, so ignore it. So this was a great success to internationalize the issue and bring an outside eyes, to bring the European Union in, to bring American eyes, Canadian eyes, and the world's eyes to see what was really going on here, which put considerable pressure on Westminster and made it easier for them to be open to try and do this deal. So there were a couple of ceasefires on both sides, and George Mitchell at this time had remarried, and he had a new son born in October of 1997. And he rushed home for the birth, and things were going really badly, and he said, I don't know if I'm going to go back. Maybe we have to pull the plug. We weren't making any progress. The Loyalists kept walking out, whichever group. But when his son was born, he called his aide in Belfast, and he said, tell me how many kids were born in the 6 counties today. So he called him back, and there were 61 kids born that day, and he said he contemplated that, and he wanted those 61 kids to grow up with the same opportunities that his young son, Andrew, would have. So he made a resolve and went back, and he unilaterally created a deadline. He said, lads and lassies, we're going to have this wrapped up by May, or it isn't going to happen. So by creating this deadline, he put some additional pressure on all sides to come to the table and make some concessions. And the bottom line was that a lot came together at the right moments to do this. Even that last week, a Holy Week, Prime Minister Bertie Ahern was saying, I don't think it's going to happen. And to connect with bad timing, his mother unexpectedly dropped dead that week, Holy Week, and he had to go home and bury her. And others have commented who were in the negotiations that even the Loyalists were really impressed the fact that he would turn around after burying his own mother and jump right back into the talks, that they were impressed by his seriousness that he brought to the table, in addition to all the patience and listening skills and negotiating skills that George Mitchell brought to the table. So, and that last 2 nights, President Clinton notoriously is a guy who's up all night anyhow, but he did not sleep those 2 nights because he was, obviously with the time change or whatever, he was calling, Mitchell would call and say, you got to call David Trimble, you got to call Tony Blair, you got to call Ian Paisley, you got to call Jerry Adams, you got to call Martin McGuinness. So he kept using the power of the presidency, his personal time, in calling and making these last calls, cajoling and pushing and pulling and doing whatever he could to get everybody into that last room. And finally, even on the day before, Mitchell said he wasn't sure if this was going to happen. David Trimble did not agree to it with the DUP, but Ian Paisley amazingly said, we're going to go with him. So that was significant. They were the largest Loyalist party at the time. And obviously, most of you are familiar with his rather staunch views of the world. So the fact that they were willing to do it really was a major breakthrough. The fact that the nationalists were willing to give up the armed fight and to have this agreement all came together on that Friday, April 10th, 1998. Just quickly, these were some of the elements of the Good Friday Agreement. There were essentially 3 strands. One dealt with reconstituting the governments and governance of the 6 counties. The second one was dealing with north-south institutions, meaning how could Dublin and the 6 counties coordinate, particularly there were 12 different areas, things that were not so contentious, things like tourism and agriculture and medicine, things that made sense to deal with and work together to promote within the one island. And then there were East-West institutions which brought Dublin and London to work together more closely on the implementation of all these. It sort of gave Dublin an official role and a consulting role or more, possibly, and to move forward. So these were some of those elements under those three strands, that there would be a returned assembly to Stormont. So there was a creation of a Northern Ireland Assembly and a Northern Ireland Executive, which would be made up of the largest parties of the Assembly. It put the burden on the Republic to go back to the people and ask for them to give up Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, which De Valera had written decades before, which indicated under the Constitution that Ireland had the right to all corners of the island. So they didn't necessarily give up that, but they took it out of that as a sign of good faith. Britain gave up under the Act of 1803 the right to complete ownership of Ireland, so there was some concessions on both sides. Obviously, there was a greater focus on human rights. Decommissioning was a huge issue. General de Chastelain from Canada oversaw meetings with the paramilitary organizations, the IRA and the Loyalist groups, as to how to dispose of these weapons and to verify that. So it was a very difficult and delicate negotiating process that went back and forth for years. The recognition that there could be a border poll, and that the main thing, as I said, come back to was consent. That any time that there's that the leaders of the parties say we feel time is ripe to check on this issue, that both the Dublin and London governments will be required to have a referendum to see if there's support for reunification. This concept that there's part of it that you could identify if you were a resident of the 6 counties, you could call yourself Irish, you could call yourself British, or you could call yourself, use both. And it sort of created more of a comfort zone that people weren't having to be, at this point in time, one or the other. One of the huge issues, too, was the police reform. So the RUC, which, as I said, had such a horrible reputation, was disbanded and created the policing service in Northern Ireland, which mandated any new recruits into the force would be half and half from each community. So it's really changed the face over these past 25 years, the whole face of the policing in the north, in the 6 counties. So this was the vote on, I think it was then a month later, about a month or 6 weeks after the signing of the Good Friday Accord. And I just to digress one more minute, I happen to be very honored with my good friend Tom Roach to be in Ireland a couple weeks after the signing, but we attended the Sinn Féin Ardèche, which was their political convention, where they reconvened to actually vote to support this prior to the vote. And there still was a lot of hardliners. It wasn't a guaranteed vote, but it really was an exciting time to be there at that political convention. And they had released the Balcombe Street 4, unknown to anyone in the room other than a couple who, because part of the whole negotiations too was a release of prisoners on both sides. People who had been caught up in the violence and who were facing life sentences and such. These 4 guys were in London prison, so in the midst of this convention, all of a sudden, these 4, to many of the people there, heroes, walked out on stage, and it really was one of the most electric moments I will never forget, when it took a minute before people realized what was going on and who they were, and it really was a joyous moment. The election happened a couple weeks later, and as you can see, in the 6 counties, even, it passed with 71%, and in the Republic, it passed with over 94%. So it was a huge, overwhelming support by all parts of the island to support the Good Friday Accord. And just briefly, because as I said, I could go on more and more, some of the other players, obviously on the top left is Ian Paisley. Here on your left is David Trimble, who was the leader of the DUP, and John Hume, who was the leader of the SDLP, and at a later date when Bono brought them up on stage during a concert to celebrate the Good Friday Accord. You probably recognize Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams from Sinn Féin, and you might not recognize, you probably recognize the picture, but Father Alec Reed is praying over a victim of this violence in the 6 counties. And Father Alec Reed was, I think he was a redemptorist, priest from one of my home counties of Tipperary, but his ministry was in the north, and unfortunately happened to be with his people at this horrible day. But he was a remarkable go-between between he had done ministry in the Maze and gotten to know Jerry Adams and others. So he was a significant go-between between Adams and some of the members of the nationalist community and the Dublin government and others. So he played a rather unpublished role as far as reaching out when it would have been a political death for anybody in Dublin to talk to Sinn Féin. That they were starting communications and opening up the dialogue and helping facilitate the Adams and John Hume relationship that helped build a foundation for what ended up coming together for the Good Friday Accord. So, as I said, I could go on, but those were some of the major characters, and I left out a lot, but we're back now 25 years in, and in one way, I'm still very optimistic, even though the Assembly is not meeting, the North-South Councils aren't meeting, but I'm still hopeful that they're going to come together soon and put the institutions in the 6 counties back together. Right now, the Loyalists are boycotting the Assembly, ostensibly because of the Irish Protocol. Richie Sunak, the new Prime Minister, has come up with a solution in his mind. I think it seems like a decent proposal, and so we'll see once that's in place if they will take the opportunity to come back to government. Of course, the real sense is that a year ago, Mary Lou McDonald, she's the president of Sinn Féin, but Michelle O'Neill is the president in the 6 counties of Sinn Féin, received the most votes. So by under the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, she would be the elected First Minister of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And in the past 25 years, it's only been a Loyalist previously who has been the First Minister. So even though there's not a lot of difference in power between the First Minister and the Deputy Minister, it's a very symbolic thing that the Loyalists still are struggling, coming to deal with the fact that the Nationalists would have equal power. So, so much has changed, and it's a remarkably different place than it was when I first went there in the 1980s. And it's only getting better, and it's because of the Good Friday Agreement. And we still need all of you guys to keep working. You need to be asking our electeds to still be involved to enforce the Good Friday Agreement. We see the President leaning on the Prime Minister saying, you know, there's not going to be a trade agreement if you guys are messing with the Good Friday Agreement. So we have a strong advocate in the White House and in Congress too. So we need to keep that support up. The role that you played in getting us here continues. It needs more patience, more energy to get us to where we want to be. So thank you all, and happy 25th anniversary to the Good Friday Accord. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Any questions for John Meyer? Any questions? I feel like Phil Donahue here.
Thanks, Phil. Did Boston College and David, Professor Toomey, play much of a role?
I don't have a sense of his exact role. What's been so neat is, as I said, and why I had the club's picture up here, was that so many Irish Americans played a role to make this happen, to get on the attention and not allow this to be swept under the rug. I don't know of his personal involvement or not, I'm sorry to say. So,
Over here, John.
yeah.
Could you just take a minute to comment on where you think possible paths going forward are with, Brexit and whether it's going to be a hard boundary, either Irish sea boundary, or just the possibilities, what could happen?
Yeah, I feel very confident that, and perhaps naively so, that there will be no hard border. Both the American leadership and the European Union leadership have been very clear to Britain that we aren't going there. And so Britain can't, they can talk a good talk, and it all depends too, how their parliamentary system, if the votes of the Ulster Unionists become a factor in whatever governing coalition is operating in London. Like when Theresa May was in power, she had to rely on those 9 or 10 unionist votes for her government to stay together. So she was her hands were very tied. Signac is as I said, a globalist. He recognized the importance of trade. He's one of the richest, maybe the richest person to ever be prime minister. So his wife comes from one of the richest Indian families in the world. So his orientation, with all of his upper crust education and class system, I think he won't allow that to happen, because it'll be detrimental to the UK to cut off trade with to get into a trade war with the EU or with the Americans. So it's still got to be worked out. So this most latest thing only came up about 10 days ago. Essentially, the loyalists were upset because they felt they were being treated differently than the rest of the UK. But of course, being embittered people sometimes see only the glass half empty. That instead of seeing the 6 counties in a beautiful position to have full trade with the EU and full trade with the UK, and the opportunities presented by that, because the 6 counties is really one of the poorest places in all of Europe. It's, even though things have been much better in the last 2 decades, it still is an extremely impoverished place. And so they're in a unique place that they could be growing their economy. And I think that in the long run, that the young people, only who grew up being part of the European Union and thinking of themselves as European, are only going to ultimately say, hey, our life in the future is much better as part of a united or federated Republic of Ireland and part of the EU than being this little corner of an isolated United Kingdom. So I'm hopeful that...
Well, that's got to be part of what makes loyalists nervous, right? Is they see in the long term a backsliding to where the Republic can have a whole island.
Yes, but we've crossed that threshold with the Good Friday Accord that we're acknowledging consent, right? So we're on the political battlefield. We're not using our rifles and pistols.
But it could happen politically, couldn't it? Instead of
Yes,
yeah, right.
but they of course don't want that, and that's why they don't even want this little differentiation with the trade between the 6 counties. They're so fearful but I believe that even the younger loyalists are not as fearful as their parents, and see, because of the recent years, see a different options and opportunity, and see the benefits that peace has brought to them. So I'm hopeful.
One more over here.
Yep.
My question's along the same lines. And I haven't been following all the news, but there's a bit on the protocol. And just wondering how that, what's the voice of Northern Ireland in the protocol? All I've seen is the European Union and the British Prime Minister. And as it relates place of the Good Friday Agreement with self-identity?
As to the protocol, did you say?
Yeah.
So the protocol was part of the Brexit, so in my mind, as an Irish nationalist, Brexit's been a great gift. I don't know why, I understand why some of the reasons they did it, but I think it's only hastened the day that Ireland will be independent and united. The protocol was when, the Brexiteers were giddy about getting out of the European Union. They didn't think through all the ramifications, and they didn't want to talk about any nasty little details. Well, ironically, the loyalists in the 6 counties followed their lead party and supported Brexit and leaving the Union. If they had that to do over again, I think they would vote differently. But the protocol created this emphasis, we're going to do whatever we can to avoid a hard border. We can't go back to, there's 270 different crossing points between the Republic and the 6 counties. And the minute you put one stand up there, or one piece of equipment, or one toll booth, or whatever, that's like saying to some of the hard right nationalists, like, go ahead, I dare you to knock that off my shoulder. It's just going to invite that. So I don't see how they can get it done and turn their backs on the EU really leaning on them. And as I said, at least at the moment, a White House that's leaning on them. So
Thank you,
thanks so
John.
much.
John Myers, everybody.